I'm terrified for every brown person in our community. I'm terrified that it is okay for ICE agents to do what they did on March 11th and essentially kidnap 3 people in our community because they just rounded up the brown people in the house.
Welcome to the Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. When ICE agents launched an immigration raid in South Burlington on March 11th, they ran into a wall of resistance. Neighbors linked arms in an attempt to stop the masked agents from entering a house in their effort to arrest and deport a Mexican-born man. Protesters blocked an ICE vehicle and hurled insults and objects. ICE agents deployed flashbang grenades. Vermont State Police and local police shoved, dragged, and even choked some protesters, according to public testimony at the Statehouse. 3 occupants of the house who were not named in a warrant were arrested by ICE. Outside, 6 protesters were arrested, 3 by state police and 3 by Burlington police. Resistance did not end on the streets of South Burlington. Last week, Chittenden County State's Attorney Sarah George announced that she would not charge the 6 protesters who were arrested. She noted that they did not have criminal records, and it was not solely protesters who bear the burden of all the harm caused that day. George also blamed police officers who agitated, who escalated, and who responded in a way that may be ultimately deemed legal, but was also unacceptable. George has called for an independent review of the law enforcement response and referred 3 of those arrested to an alternative restorative justice program. State police leaders have criticized George in unusually harsh and personal terms, blasting her for a disheartening decision that sets a dangerous precedent. In the end, the entire ICE raid was found to have been triggered by a case of mistaken identity. The 3 occupants of the house who were arrested have since been released. I met with Chittenden County State's Attorney Sarah George in her office in Burlington. George is part of a national group of progressive prosecutors who've teamed up in an organization called Fight Against Federal Overreach. It includes Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner and Minneapolis DA Mary Moriarty. I began by asking Sarah George how she came to be the state's attorney in Vermont's most populous county.
So I became a prosecutor right out of law school. I started here in January 2011 under former Chittenden County State's Attorney TJ Donovan. I was a deputy state's attorney. I spent the first 4 years doing the VAWA docket, which means I was the domestic violence prosecutor in this office. And then I moved to a general docket for about 2.5 years. And TJ Donovan then became our attorney general, leaving a vacancy in the seat. As he had 2 more years left in his term, it was an appointment initially rather than an election. So I put my name in to be considered. My name was ultimately sent up to the governor, and in January of 2017, I was sworn in as the Chittenden County State's Attorney, and then formally elected by the community in 2018, and then again in 2022. So I've been in this position now for about a little over 9 years, and 15 as a prosecutor.
You have written, when I was in law school, I was exposed to the injustices within our criminal justice system. I was appalled at the systemic racism and implicit bias that plagued our system from start to finish. Prosecutors are part of the problem, but they can also be part of the solution. So I want you to talk about both parts of that statement, the systemic racism and bias that you saw, and how you feel 9 years in, you're part of the solution.
I actually initially saw a lot of those same injustices when I was in graduate school. I got my master's degree in forensic psychology, and so I was visiting a lot of prisons and jails and talking to people with major mental health issues, and also talking to their families or to the victims of their crimes about what led that person to get to the place they did. And just seeing a lot of gaps in our system that really failed not just the person who was harmed, the victim in the crime, but also the person who committed the harm. So that's what ultimately led me to law school. And then all of that was just exacerbated by the way in which our legal system is built, frankly, on the oppression of Black and brown people and poor people, people with mental health issues and substance use issues. It really was designed to disappear them, and police and prosecutors and judges and jails have played a big part in that by using our discretion to over-police and over-prosecute and over-incarcerate those folks. So I've been trying to use this position, not just as the state's attorney, but even as a deputy state's attorney, just to use our enormous power and our incredible discretion to even the playing field a little bit, to really be clear about why we're prosecuting someone and make sure that we think we can actually do good by doing that.
So you're in, the belly of the beast, the heart of the system as a prosecutor. And where do you feel that you've made a difference in the problems that you just described?
I think first and foremost, by acknowledging it, by acknowledging the problems and acknowledging the foundation of our system and the injustices within our legal system. It's rare that prosecutors acknowledge the problem. And that has certainly come with a lot of pushback, but I think people haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about it. And so my first hope was just that people started to think about it and started to talk about it really bluntly, because it's a really uncomfortable position, or it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, and making people have it can create really good conversation if they're willing. And so forcing the conversation was my first goal, and I think that we've certainly done that. And then implementing practices and policies that are based on evidence and research and data to guide some of our decision making so that it isn't as susceptible to implicit bias, so it isn't as susceptible to the sort of history of our system, and allowing us as prosecutors to feed into those injustices.
Give me an example of implicit bias and how that, I think that term is perhaps not familiar to some people. Where do you see it in the work that you do?
I see it mostly in our implicit biases against unhoused people. I get a lot of individuals or a lot of people in the community who have intertwined unhoused people with public safety, or people who are struggling with substance use with public safety. And sometimes that happens, but it's actually, there are a lot of unhoused people in our community that have never committed a crime, but our implicit biases allow us to see a person who is unhoused and assume they have committed crimes, or see someone who is struggling with substance use or mental health issues and assume that they should be in our legal system or they should be in jail. So that's where I see it the most. And then certainly in our community and in the state, a implicit bias that Black and brown folks are more dangerous or more likely to engage in criminal behavior. And so therefore, when they do, they are fitting a narrative rather than that actually just being a narrative they already had in their head.
You have been in the news just in the last week in that you recently declined to press charges against 6 protesters who were arrested in the South Burlington ICE raid that turned violent. What were these protesters charged with, and why are you not charging them?
So I see them in 2 sort of groups. There were 3 people that the Vermont State Police cited, and each of them were cited with disorderly conduct. I declined those 3 cases because in looking at the affidavits and then looking at the body-worn camera footage from those cases, it was very unclear to me what those 3 individuals did that was any different than the 40-plus other people who were locking arms and, sort of standing strong against the ICE vehicle leaving with the 3 folks that they left with. And So, and they, none of them had any criminal records. I just didn't understand why those three people should sort of bear the burden of everybody's conduct that day. So I declined those three cases. The three cases that Burlington cited and sent us were hindering arrest, impeding arrest, and an assault on a law enforcement officer. Those ones I didn't decline. I sent a direct referral of those cases to the Burlington Community Justice Center, hoping that the parties would engage in a more restorative process with the Burlington Police. And so that is still my hope. And whether Burlington police officers decide to partake in that is obviously up to them. And the reason I did that is that those three individuals certainly escalated to a point that I felt was more than the disorderly conducts. But I do want to be really clear that although one of them was cited for simple assault on a law enforcement officer, there was absolutely no allegation that she caused any harm to an officer. The allegation was that she threw an umbrella towards an officer. It did not strike the officer. The officer was not harmed. Had an officer been harmed and that had been the allegation, I don't know if my decision would have been different, but I just want to be very clear that there wasn't no allegation that an officer had any injury or was even struck by the object.
You said in a statement that there were some law enforcement officials who agitated, who escalated, and who responded in a way that may be ultimately deemed legal, but was also unacceptable. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people have seen a lot of the videos at this point, and, it's a very high, the excessive force statute in Vermont is a very high burden, a high standard in order to find that an officer used excessive force. And so I didn't want to make any sort of legal determination on that point. But in watching the videos, there was clearly circumstances in which officers also escalated at times that I didn't think was necessary and behaved in some circumstances, I think, unprofessionally and unnecessarily, as did protesters. I have never said that they didn't, and I still don't think. I think there were some protesters that absolutely escalated the situation and made things a lot more dangerous than necessary. But I just think looking at the videos, and I've watched all of them, I believe, at this point, there was a lot of behavior on both sides that was not necessary and made the situation a lot more escalated than it needed to be.
So in response, there has been some pretty furious pushback from Vermont Public Safety Commissioner Jennifer Morrison and Vermont State Police Director Colonel Matthew Birmingham. And I want to get you to respond to several of the things that they said in a statement and in press conferences. The two of them said that they took offense at the suggestion that state and local law enforcement bear equal responsibility with the protesters for criminal behavior. And they said it sets, quote, a dangerous precedent, and went on to say that lawbreakers in Chittenden County already seem to know that they can act with impunity. What is your response?
I'm not sure how much of a response to give to something like that. I think that, again, my position is clear. I don't believe I said that there was equal responsibility. I think that the situation was very complicated. It was very emotionally charged. And our local law enforcement participated in the unlawful arrest of 3 of our community members. And I think that there has to be a bit more accountability shared in what happened on March 11th. And so far, I haven't seen that. And I'm not, again, indicating that anybody in law enforcement broke the law. I never have. I'm merely saying that there was a part played by law enforcement that I think has so far lacked any accountability from law enforcement. And yeah.
One of the other things they said, which they went on to say, this is Vermont Public Safety Commissioner Jennifer Morrison and Vermont State Police Director Matthew Birmingham. to impugn the ability of the police to conduct fair, thorough investigations directly undermines all the cases in the Chittenden County State's Attorney's Office, which relies on the investigative work of police departments each day to support every case the office is prosecuting. I wonder if you could respond to that, but also to the idea that they are suggesting that there is a breakdown between your office and the police with whom you have to work quite closely.
Yeah, and I continue to. I mean, I've worked on many cases with the Vermont State Police since March 11th. I've had many long conversations with state troopers about pending cases that we have with absolutely no issue. From my perspective, asking that there be an independent review of law enforcement conduct that is not investigated by the law enforcement agencies whose behavior is being questioned is incredibly different and separate from law enforcement sending us a case in which they are not a party to, that they are not alleged to have committed any wrongdoing. I see those things as completely separate, and I don't see the comparison at all, and I'm a little surprised that comparison was made, because Vermont State Police send us cases all the time, and we charge those cases, and we have a good relationship with the troopers who charge them or who send them to us, and I just don't see the comparison there to cases where in those cases Vermont State Police are not the person alleged to have done wrongdoing.
What is the role? And I think a lot of people looking at what went down in that ICE raid, what is the role for local law enforcement in a situation where these federal agents are carrying out a raid? And I think one of the more shocking things that I saw in the body cam videos that have now been posted was the ICE officer responding to a South Burlington police officer who asked him, is this really worth it to get this one guy? And the ICE agent said, I'll do whatever my management tells me to do. And then it falls to local police to decide what role they're going to play. What role should local law enforcement play in those situations?
I don't know. And I mean, that is actually something I've said since the beginning, is that I don't know what the right answer is. And I think that ultimately it's up to communities to decide individually what they want their law enforcement to be doing in these situations. I know that several agencies since Richmond, for example, I know that the Richmond chief has asked his select board, what do you want us to do if this happens? And I think, unfortunately, we didn't have those conversations before we got to March 11th, and maybe we should have, but my hope is that since this incident, every chief of police in their community has gone to their select board or city council or mayor and asked, what do you want us to do when this happens, so that their community has a little bit of a say in what they want their local agencies to do. It's not ultimately up to me. It's up to every individual community.
Earlier this year, you chose not to charge a group of elderly residents who were cited by the state police for criminal trespass during a peaceful civil disobedience action in the lobby of a Williston business park that houses a major ICE surveillance center. Why did you choose not to charge them?
Several reasons, but I think primarily when we got those cases, again, looking at these 12 individuals, many of them were older in age and had no criminal records, or, maybe an unlawful trespass from years ago that was probably also a protest-like situation. And, our office is incredibly busy. We have thousands of cases pending. We are often short-staffed. We have, a trial coming up for Jason Eaton, the guy that shot the 3 Palestinian boys in our community. We just don't have the resources to charge 12 people with a misdemeanor, a nonviolent misdemeanor offense, for so little outcome. my office has to think about the resources that we have to expend on cases. And in that particular case, there would absolutely have been a First Amendment challenge that I think would have been successful with our current judges. And, I think it from my perspective legally was a gray area and one that I just didn't see the benefit of expending enormous resources from our office to potentially lose on a First Amendment challenge. I wanted to err on the side of protecting the First Amendment right in those cases and not expending unnecessary resources.
Let me follow up about the case of Jason Eaton, as you mentioned, the person who's been charged with shooting the Palestinian youth here. It's been 2.5 years since the actual incident, and we're seeing why is this case dragging on for so long, and perhaps it's emblematic of other cases.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of to my point, is that our office handles a lot of very serious cases. And with COVID, we were unable to try any of those cases. And it has taken us a significant amount of time to get through them, particularly our murders, which one of which wrapped up this morning in a sentencing. And we have one left from 2022. All of those cases needed to take priority in the court, and we needed to get all of those cases resolved or tried. And it took us this long to do it. And so Jason Eaton's case has just been waiting essentially for its turn. And based on how many other big cases we've had to try, it just took significantly longer than we would like for it to.
What's a reasonable expectation of where that goes? I understand there's now an appeal about an insanity defense. What should we be expecting?
Yeah, so it's not an appeal. The defense just gave us notice of an insanity defense. The deadline for that was over a year ago, and so we are making the argument to the court that this is too late. The notice is too late and shouldn't be allowed. We're trying to balance that with making sure we're not risking any conviction that we ultimately get on appeal. So we're litigating that right now and hopeful that the court will not allow it. And if they do, we're going to have to make some tough decisions about whether we go forward with trial in 5 weeks or we prolong the trial at risk of the youth not being able to get back into the country, which from my perspective is not a risk I want to take. So it's not a good situation right now. It's a very unfair situation to the boys and certainly to the state, and it's currently being litigated.
Because they may be going back, they're about to graduate college and may be going back to Palestine.
That's right, yeah. And with the current administration, there's always risk of whether they'd be able to enter back into the country.
Speaking of that backlog, you had worked with Governor Scott's office to establish an accountability court in Chittenden County. Explain what that is and what your view is now on whether it's worked.
Yeah, so we worked with the governor's office to essentially create a separate court process for individuals with 5 or more pending dockets that put them through a separate courtroom with a separate judge, with a separate prosecutor, not from our office, so that our office could focus on those homicide cases that we were talking about and more serious cases, and a separate prosecutor could focus only on the cases that were considered backlog. And I think it worked magnificently. It's not perfect. There's already some people that, are back and might be picking up new charges again, but it did allow for the clearance of over 700 cases in a very short amount of time. It has significantly decreased our overall backlog, which means that now our court has more capacity when those people do pick up 1 or 2 to immediately be responding to their behavior and holding them more accountable quicker. And we're also we've extended the program, so we do it now every Friday. We call it just the Friday docket, and anybody with 3 or more cases goes through that docket. They're heard every week. AHS is still in the building meeting with them about housing and substance use, residential programs, whatever it might be that they need. so that hopefully we can wrap those cases up sooner and we don't get back to the situation we were in before.
What is clearing 700 cases? That's kind of an astonishing number. What does that do for the rest of the workings of the criminal justice system?
It is an immediate weight that is lifted from the shoulders of the whole system. So having those cases resolved means significantly less resources the police are having to spend in the community responding to those people, and that trickles down. So a lot less resources our office has to handle in charging new cases for those individuals and issuing warrants for those people that the law enforcement then has to go out and try to locate. And then moving forward just means, my deputies and myself have a manageable number of cases. We have 150 to 200 cases each instead of 400 to 500 cases each, which is what we were dealing with previously. And that means we have capacity. We have an ability to look at each case and to give it a little bit more time, especially high-risk folks, repeat offenders, and then, of course, violent crime.
You recently joined a group of prosecutors around the country called Fight Against Federal Overreach, or FAFO, which some people may know has other colloquial meanings as well. The group says its goal is to ensure federal officials are held accountable when they exceed their lawful authority. How do you hold these federal officials accountable?
Yeah, it's a conversation that unfortunately we haven't had to have before, and we're kind of learning as we go. We meet regularly and share resources. The other complicating factor is that some other jurisdictions around the country have a little bit more like civil work involved within their offices, like in Minneapolis, my counterpart Mary Moriarty, and in Philadelphia with Larry Kasner. They have civil options available to them as well that I don't have here. But it's really a constant sharing of resources, sharing funds. If it came to having to investigate something or hire our own investigator, the idea is that we have access to grants or funders that might be able to help us to do that. I think, frankly, it's a lot more helpful for me in a small jurisdiction to have access to some of these bigger jurisdictions and bigger resource intensive resources that we just don't have here. But the answer is that I don't know yet. I think that working with our federal partners when we can is obviously helpful, and we do that every day. But when it comes to holding them accountable, it's still a little unclear in Vermont, what our options are.
Are you hearing or seeing cases where federal agents are not being held accountable and are perhaps breaking the law?
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, March 11th is an example of that. That from the information that I've seen and the documents I've reviewed, I think that officer lied in his affidavit. And
be specific what you're describing there.
I think that the ICE agent who wrote the warrant for the home on March 11th, he indicated that he was positive that the person that they were looking for in the warrant was inside the residence, despite having told others he wasn't sure. And then, of course, he wasn't inside the residence. And from my perspective, if that happened in state court, that officer would probably be getting a Brady letter from me for being untruthful.
And explain what a Brady letter is.
A Brady letter essentially means that our office has found that officer is not credible, and we would not call them as a witness. And in Vermont, because of the small jurisdictions that we work with, that would mean that officer is likely terminated as a police officer and could lead to them being decertified as an officer. So if that had happened, if that had been a local officer, I think that would have happened. And it appears, from my perspective, that federally there was no impact on that agent for falsifying a warrant.
Are we just in a time now, are you concerned of total impunity for federal law enforcement?
Yes, I am. I think even the idea that Vermont State Police, and I know South Burlington as well, feel like if they hadn't been present on March 11th, that ICE agents would have significantly harmed, if not killed, protesters. That is a terrifying thought, that we are in a time when the very people that we are concerned about killing our community members, if our local law enforcement aren't there, are also the ones that we're able to get all of our law enforcement officers to be there, is a really terrifying thought to me.
As somebody in the position you're in, you are, have the powers of the state and prosecution and such. As you look out at the country right now, do you worry that the courts and the legal system itself are being tested and may not be up to the task of holding accountable this government?
I do. I think we see it a lot, and it feels very helpless. We see, even as prosecutors, we've had some of our defendants who are charged with, very serious offenses, have been in jail and then have been gone, have been deported. We've had victims who have disappeared, and there is absolutely no accountability. There is nothing that we can do about that. And from my perspective, that is a really significant strain, and also a significant insult to public safety and to the rights of people in our legal system, and also the rights of our community to have people held accountable for violence in our community, instead of ICE just taking them and sending them out of the country, where there then is no local accountability. And when we've had that happen and we reach out and ask questions, we get nothing in response. So I think that the federal government is doing a lot of disservice to our legal system, to individual constitutional rights, to victims' rights, and frankly, to public safety overall.
We have learned that, when President Trump came into office, he immediately pardoned over 1,000 people involved in the violent assault of his supporters on the U.S. Capitol. And we now know that many of those people have gone on to reoffend, often in violent crimes. I wonder, have you seen any of that kind of here? But also, what is the trickle down to the level of a county state's attorney in Vermont, where at the highest levels, people are being pardoned for certain crimes?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly stood out to me when I saw Commissioner Morrison's statement, is that, the irony of feeling like three protesters that I didn't charge with disorderly conduct is somehow going to fuel violence in our community, while ignoring that a lot of people have committed violence in our communities across the country, and our federal government has done nothing to hold them accountable. And certainly even locally, when, like I just said, when we've had some people in custody and our federal government has deported them, including victims of crime. I think it's ironic. I think it is highlighted every day for me when we hear people being upset about 3 disorderly conduct charges without being upset about much more serious cases going sort of unaccounted for by our federal government.
What's your biggest concern right now about the state of the world and how it filters into your world in law enforcement?
I think that my biggest fear right now is the safety of every person in our community who looks a particular way, or generally speaking, I'm terrified for every brown person in our community. I'm terrified that it is okay for ICE agents to do what they did on March 11th and essentially kidnap 3 people in our community because they just rounded up the brown people in the house instead of taking the time to make sure that they were even on the slightest bit of legal ground to take the 3 people who were inside and not the one person named in their warrant. If you are immune from any accountability in a situation like that, it's hard to imagine where that stops. And we have a lot of people in our community that contribute to our community in an incredible way and are afraid to leave their houses. And that, to me, is an enormous threat to public safety. I think it's an enormous threat to our just the way that we are as a community and as a country in general. And I don't see it happening. I don't see it ending anytime soon.
Do you feel like there's anything you can do about it and have an impact?
I mean, I think just continuing to talk about it and stand up for the, from my perspective, not charging the 3 disorderly conducts is not about the 3 people who committed or didn't commit disorderly conducts. It's about standing up for the 3 people who were unlawfully arrested that day by a federal administration that doesn't care about the law. And that piece of it has got to be more important. It has to be more important to every single person in our community and to our law enforcement officers that be held accountable more than the 3 people locking arms to try to keep those 3 people from being kidnapped.
Okay, well, Sarah George, I want to thank you for joining us on the Vermont Conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
Sarah George is the elected Chittenden County State's Attorney. That does it for this week's Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Thanks so much for listening.